Did the apostles do devotions? Did they practice anything like what we would call a daily quiet time? Now, there's nothing in the Sermon on the Mount saying, "Blessed are those who read their Bibles and pray for 30 minutes before breakfast." But we do see clues. Peter, in Acts chapter 10, went up on the roof in the 6th hour, specifically for prayer. And Jesus, in Mark chapter 1, rose very early in the morning when it was still dark, went out to a desolate place and prayed. You see, the early Christians and Jesus himself had a rhythm. And I'm convinced that James, the brother of Jesus, had a very specific morning routine. In fact, based on the way he structured his letter, I think I know exactly what chapter of the Old Testament he was reading the morning he sat down to write his letter. Today we are going to look at the book of James through a different lens, looking for a hidden map behind James's logic. Now, I put this map together for you, which charts the Old Testament connections in this book, and you can download it for free in the description below. Now, if you want more deep dives like this, be sure to hit subscribe. And now, let's pull up a chair with James at his local Starbucks and sip a little bit of coffee with the brother of Jesus. The book of James has been called the Proverbs of the New Testament, which makes sense because it reads like wisdom literature, filled with practical advice for living and relationships, which James is going to place within exhortations or imperatives, that is, commands. There are over 50 commands in this very short book. 52 commands in a book which only has 108 verses. Quite unique. Look at some of them. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you face trials of many kinds. That's a command. Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Confess your sins to one another, and you will be forgiven. Another unique feature of this letter is that it wasn't written to any one specific church congregation. Unlike Paul's letters, which were typically prompted by some kind of problem or question which Paul was writing to address, James wrote his one and only letter to all 12 tribes in the entire Dispersion, simply recording all of his best teachings in one place for distribution to all Jewish congregations throughout the entire empire. So what is the teaching of James? Well, he doesn't construct a careful argument running from the beginning of his letter all the way to the end like the Apostle Paul, but rather he presents a collection of short moral essays which are only loosely connected and which return to the same set of common themes. These are themes which James introduces in the introduction to his letter here in chapter 1 and then returns to throughout the rest of his letter. These are themes like wisdom and the tongue or speech, hearing and doing, and wealth, how Christians are to treat both the rich and the poor. James returns to this last theme of wealth in chapter 2, and he uses another one of his imperatives to say, show no partiality, but rather you are to treat both the rich and the poor who come into your assembly or your synagogue, that is your synagogue. Treat both the rich and the poor the same. And then he's going to ground this imperative in the Torah. He says that if you show partiality, well, then you are transgressing the law. But if you love your neighbor as yourself, well, then you are fulfilling the law. Now, do you remember where in the law God calls Israel to love their neighbor? It's in your favorite book, Leviticus. Now, there's a good chance that that was James's favorite book too, because he will quote from the book of Leviticus 6 times in his short little letter. But curiously, all 6 quotations come from the same chapter of that book. You see, to love your neighbor as yourself comes from Leviticus chapter 19. Now that makes me wonder, perhaps James was reading and meditating on this chapter when he sat down to write his letter to the 12 tribes in the Dispersion. Let's see how this works. So James begins his exposition of Leviticus 19 here in verse 11. Why verse 11? Well, let's jump over to Leviticus 19 and see if we can find out. Well, the first 4 verses of this chapter are all kind of like general introduction. They say, "You shall be holy, for I am holy. I am the Lord your God." And then the next section, 5 to 8, is all about sacrifices, which are no longer relevant in the New Covenant age. And therefore, James picks up his exposition in verse 11 with, "You shall not steal, you shall not lie, and you shall not swear falsely by my name." Now, this final imperative, James is going to quote in chapter 5 of his letter. You shall not swear falsely. Chapter 5, verse 12. He introduces this imperative with the phrase, "Above all, my brothers, do not swear." Now, why would James attach the phrase "above all" to the measly command, "do not swear"? Well, it could be because Leviticus 19 ties "do not swear" to profaning the name of the Lord your God. Now that sounds pretty serious. James continues his exposition of this chapter. "You shall not oppress your neighbor, and the wages of the hired worker shall not remain with you. Do not hold those wages back." Well, James is going to accuse the rich in chapter 5 of doing that very thing. The wages of the laborers, he says, you have kept back. Now, this whole section in chapter 5, James is going to embed in his discussion on the day of the Lord. The day of judgment. This will be a day of relief for the righteous, but it will be a day of slaughter for the oppressor. Now, we've already seen the context of James's teaching on partiality, but now we can see the source text. Here in Leviticus 19, verse 15, "You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but rather in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor." Well, the very next verse is going to condemn slander, which is perhaps the origin of one of James's favorite themes, the tongue, which is here in chapter 4, and it shows up also in chapter 3, and in chapter 1. Finally, it appears as if James links bearing a grudge with grumbling against your brother because both commands address internal strife. This grumbling is specifically against one of the sons of your own people, that is, a fellow Israelite, and the grumbling is against one another, that is, someone who is within the church. But what's the point? Why is James so interested in Leviticus 19? Well, James, who was writing to a Jewish audience, certainly had a high view of the law. Look at the names that he gives to it. He calls it the perfect law, the royal law, the law of liberty. But what does James mean by the law in his letter? Well, New Testament scholar Thomas Schreiner tees up this question for us in his short little book called 40 Questions About Christian and Biblical Law. In chapter 35 specifically, he asks, what does James teach us about keeping God's law? And then narrows it down to the question, what is the content of the law for James? What does the law mean for James? And importantly, are believers, Christians, still under the Old Testament law? Well, Schreiner will continue to observe very helpfully that while James will quote the Old Testament a lot, and Leviticus 19 in particular, James will never mention circumcision, Sabbath, or food laws. You see, the ceremonial dimensions of the law are entirely absent from this letter. That is an important fact. But what about those adjectives that James applies to the law? The perfect law, the royal law, the law of liberty. Well, while it's true that Psalm 19 seems to connect the Mosaic law to this phrase perfection, Tom Schreiner is going to argue that the law of liberty must be connected to the phrase that James uses called the Word. However, I think that Douglas Moo does a better job solidifying this connection in his commentary in the Tyndale New Testament Commentary series. Doug Moo, he says, here we are in pink, it will be noticed that the word in verse 22 has become the law in verse 25. Take a look at this. So in verse 22, we are to be hearers and doers of the word. But in verse 25, we are to be hearers and doers of the law. Therefore, this implies that the word is equivalent to the perfect law and the law of liberty. Both Schreiner and Moo contend that this word is the gospel, the good news of Jesus' transformative death and resurrection. And that is because this word, which we must hear and do in verse 22, must be the same as the implanted word, which is able to save our souls in verse 21, and the word of truth in verse 18, through which we are brought forth. Now, this word, to bring forth, it is the word to give birth. We are born again through this word, which is able to save our souls. So what was James meditating on as he was sipping his latte and reading Leviticus 19? Well, perhaps he was reflecting on how the royal law of King Jesus frees his people or liberates them to keep God's law from the heart. The new covenant law becomes the implanted word of Jeremiah 31, a law which is written on or implanted in our hearts. Well, if you're interested in following James and his Bible reading plan, you might want to check out this video about Moses, the tabernacle, and the book of Leviticus next.